Hi, everybody. So, before we dig into the content this week, I want to talk a little bit about the Mediterranean Sea. First, to say that it means in the middle, maybe, of the land, terra. And when we look at this map of the Mediterranean during the Greek period, when ancient Greece had its little colonies all over the place in that kind of orangey pink, you realize that that body of water in blue really is kind of in the middle of the land. Jumping forward to what we will talk about next week and the Roman Empire, and of course the Romans called it Mare Nostrum, meaning our sea. You see again how Rome not only hugs the Mediterranean, but actually the empire ends up stretching for as far as Scotland all the way over to Asia Minor. So between these two cultures, ancient Greece on one, Rome on the other, we have Etruria, seen here in the boot-shaped bit of land that is Italy. And Etruria, or the culture is Etruscan, kind of thrives between around 800 BCE, taking us to 400 BCE. And so it is overlapping quite a bit with the kind of last gasp of ancient Egypt, with ancient Greece, absolutely, and with the Phoenician culture. And because it's sticking out in the Mediterranean, it is an important example of a kind of superhighway, a stop along the superhighway that was the Mediterranean. And Etruria gives us some really good examples of a culture that has its indigenous side and a culture that also absorbs influences from these kind of power players that on and off dominate the Mediterranean. So speaking of that, looking at this map, we know that Etruria was composed of a series of city-states, and we suspect those city-states it adopted from Greece, because Greek colonies were all throughout this area. But you'll notice that at its height, looking at this map, the Etruscan area of influence was a good part of the peninsula that is Egypt. What am I saying? Italy. But speaking of Egypt, another example of absorption from some of the power players in the Mediterranean is this thing. Now, it might not be the prettiest version of this thing, but oh my goodness. So the rounded arch was actually invented in Egypt. We didn't talk about it much because Egypt did not utilize the rounded arch in any of its temple architecture, tombs, what have you. However, Etruria, running into contact with Egyptian builders, saw value in the rounded arch and absolutely adopted it. So this is an Etruscan rounded arch. It's going to later be called the Roman arch because, again, poor old Etruscans can't catch a break. But regardless, the rounded arch is going to actually come into play much more next week. However, I'm going to take an opportunity to talk for just a moment about the rounded arch, and then we're going to talk more about Etruscan religion. But the fact of the matter is, our post and lintel construction, which we have seen basically since the beginning of this class, has its limitations. You can't span very wide spaces if you have two vertical supports and just one old stone lintel. What the arch provides us, and here I might say this diagram gives you way more vocabulary than you need. All I want you to note here in the physics of the rounded arch is the fact that the individual stones of an arch are in fact trapezoidal in shape. So they actually are almost wedge shaped, and thus they are quite snug as they rise in their little arc. Not only that, but if you cut your trapezoidal stones, which by the way are called voussoirs, if you cut them precisely and stack them equally with a great deal of care, and imagine you're kind of stacking them one on, alternating on the left side, the right side, the left side, the right side. And finally, insert a keystone labeled here at the top. Those stones will stay together without the assistance of any mortar, cement, what have you. In other words, through sheer physics and compression, a rounded arch can stay intact and extremely stable and extremely strong without having to slather a bunch of mortar in between those stones. So I'm going to close the sidebar right now, but keep all of that in mind when we start talking about Rome next week. But I feel like it's important to take the opportunity to say that it was actually the Etruscans who utilized the rounded arch in very effective ways. And without the rounded arch utilized by the Etruscans, I'm not sure if Rome could have become what it did actually become, which is a vast empire. So more on that next week, but this just kind of reinforces the role of Etruria as this sort of in-between catalyst for innovation and change between the Greeks on one side, the Egyptians on another side, and the Romans in the future. Okay, so let's talk about religion for a minute. So, like the Greeks, the Etruscans were polytheistic. What does that mean? That means lots of gods. And to worship the lots of gods, and many of the gods were associated with nature, sun, sky, water. They often met outside, initially under kind of temporary canopies, and then eventually transpose that idea into something more permanent. In the case of their gods, they had some of their indigenous gods, but they also, again, through contact with Greece in trade, most likely, they adopted Greek gods, including Apollo and Dionysus. So our Etruscans also had something called augurs, who were religious officials. Sole job of augurs was to watch and interpret flight patterns of birds and lightning patterns for some kind of revelation of some future event. Another fun job, I can only imagine, was digging the entrails out of sacrificed animals, and especially the liver, and examining the liver. And again, if you were trained to do this, you knew what you were looking for, and somehow that animal's liver would indicate some future event. Okay, so here's the thing about the Etruscans. They built their temples, their religious structures, out of wood. So guess how many Etruscan temples we have left? Yes, you're right, 0, none. Now we have 19th century versions of Etruscan temples that have been made into more permanent structures of stone. And we certainly have models, lots and lots of models of Etruscan temples. Now, I will say that archaeologists have, through excavation, been able to determine that, yes, indeed, the temples of the Etruscans were wooden, and they were certain scale, and they tended to be raised up on a platform, and they tended to have sculpture, but sculpture along the roof line, which is slightly different from our Greek friends. So again, the other point about Etruscan temples, unlike our Greek friends, is the columns are concentrated just on one end. And so it's a far more solid structure without the columns on all four sides. Okay, So that's the temple as we believe it looked like. Now we have actual sculpture from the temples, sculpture made of terracotta. So you might recall terracotta means baked clay. And I'm showing you a statue of what we believe is Apollo, or what the Etruscans would call Aplu, who was originally from the top of their temple. So I'm pointing out here one of these little architectural brackets to reinforce the idea that this Apollo figure would have originally been on top of the roof line. Okay, so now I want to talk about terracotta. This is around life size and was made of clay. That in itself is a fairly extraordinary feat. Now, I'm certain in some point in your lives, you've maybe going all the way back to childhood, you messed with clay. Clay's fun. No question about it. I'm going to go out on a limb and say, however, you have never made a life-size statue out of clay. That is simply a task that is for the very skilled and the very patient. Because if you think about clay, you work it when it's still soft, when it's still moist. And the idea of constructing something that's between 5 and 6 feet tall without it collapsing on itself, and then somehow transferring that to a pit where it's heated and baked, and hence the terracotta, that's baked clay, all of that's rather extraordinary. So our Etruscans are interested in statuary, for example, like the Greeks, but they're doing it their way. They're doing it in clay. So speaking of the Greeks, let's compare two roughly around the same time sculptures. I've brought back our Metropolitan Kouros from the Archaic period, and here is our Etruscan Apollo. So I'm saying roughly contemporaneous with one another. One, of course, on the left is made of stone. And as mentioned, our sculpture on the right, clay. So I'm guessing at this point you can discern maybe some similarities. For example, we are both our sculptures here depict a male with braided hair. So fair enough. And the facial features, for the most part, between the two are fairly similar. Our Etruscan statuary tends to have the so-called archaic smile, which we see slightly on the Metropolitan Kouros. We saw much more directly on the Peplos Kore from archaic Greece. Okay, so there's kind of the one similarity. I mean, besides that it's a male figure, because boy, it gets different pretty quick. All right, first things first. Greek chorus, nude. And our Apollo here, clothed in what might be described as a toga, the very kind of clothing we're going to see on Roman statuary. The stance of the two, our Metropolitan Kouros kind of reflecting that Egyptian staid pose, one foot in front of the other, both arms down by the side, shoulders above the hips. In contrast, our Etruscan figure is striding forward, and though missing now parts of arms, we see in what's remaining a kind of similarly dynamic pose of the arms. So while the Greek Kouros was very much a kind of closed, staid composition, our Apollo is all energy. Even down to, and you might be able to discern it here, maybe I'll take you back here. You can even see in the Apollo a kind of dynamism even in the depiction of the legs, the calf muscle. You see kind of veins and connective tissue that again reinforce this notion of motion and dynamism, kind of forward, kind of propelling that figure forward. Okay, so we know also with Greek, as with Greek sculpture, the terracotta Apollo, and there's another version. This is another version in another museum. They were painted, and they still bear the traces, more of the traces of paint. And this absolutely has to do with when these sculptures were discovered. So Etruscan sculptures were discovered typically in the 19th century. They were not deemed as precious and fabulous as Greek sculptures, so nobody started scrubbing the paint off of them the way collectors did with their Greek statues in the 18th century. In any case, there are now, in a couple of museums in Europe, examples of these Etruscan sculptures. And here is a little kind of formation of three. And it's believed that the figure here on the left was likely Hercules, so a heroic character from Greek mythology that also kind of migrated into Etruscan mythology and religion. Okay, so the Etruscans, they will be a kind of interesting mix of indigenous characteristics and imported characteristics from Egypt, from Greece, and kind of putting all of that in the mix, creating some foundational parts of what will be Rome next week. Okay, stay tuned. There's more to talk about. Bye.